for 5:30. There is current debate back and forth. Is this evening or noon? So good evening and good afternoon. Welcome to our question and answer session. This is our second Q&A session of the day. Thank you to everyone who participated earlier, maybe coming back for more. And welcome to everyone who's coming in for the first time to get some follow-up questions and answers and some concerns followed up on, as this is week 2 of our Cal Action Conference. This is the start of week 2. We'll preview what we have coming up next a little bit later on. But this is going to be time for folks to come and get their questions answered. We had some fantastic educational workshops last week. We had some stuff on land back and things like that as it relates to our indigenous families and communities. We had some workshops on policing and alternatives to safety. We also had a workshop that educated folks on some of the housing work that's going on around. And so, yes, also too, this is a space for folks that's planning on participating in our upcoming ledge visits, which will be kicking off this week, to, again, get some questions and stuff answered and just help make sure that folks are feeling good along the way. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we have some closed caption options available for folks that may need that. Closed captionings can be viewed by clicking on the closed captions button at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully everyone is able to see that. We have the CC button for folks, live transcript on some screens. It may look a little different, so hopefully everyone can see that. I apologize, my Spanish is not up to par for this other translation. So yeah, thank you so much. Before we get into today's session, we definitely want to take time to recognize that the ACLU acknowledges that, you know, what we call home is absolutely stolen land. This land was taken through force and trickery, and in my opinion, through policies and practices that are still in effect today. And we still can see and visualize some of the impacts of this. And we, again, want to take time to acknowledge that. While this is not a substitution for some of the deep work that folks can take advantage of when it comes to supporting our indigenous families and communities, you know, this is a small drop in the bucket and we're glad to do it. I personally live in Oakland, that's on Ohlone land. And hopefully one of my colleagues will go ahead and help me out and put a link in the chat where folks can go ahead and, you know, do some research and figure out what their particular local land that they're on and educate yourself about that. And again, with that, we also encourage folks to spend time researching not only the land that they call home, but also ways you can support our indigenous brothers and sisters and their families, their communities, their causes, and also to ancestral traditions and practices. Those are always a good way to get yourself familiar. And with that, next slide, please. Okay, so introductions. I am Katie. My name is Katie Dixon. I go by KD. I am an organizer with the ACLU of Northern California. I am so glad to be spending this time with you all. And with me today, we have some fantastic experts in the room to help us out with this. We have Cynthia, who is a senior policy advocate and organizer with the ACLU of SoCal. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for coming on and helping us out here this evening. Kalyn Dean, again, fantastic legislative advocate with the ACLU of California Action. She will be here to assist us with our questions and concerns. And we also have Kathy, I don't want to mispronounce your last name, Sher, sorry about that.
Sure.
Sher, who is also a fantastic legislative advocate with the ACLU of Cal Action. And yeah, thank you all three for being here and helping us out with this. and we really appreciate it. Amongst these three, they will provide their, again, expertise across the three different bills. If folks have questions related to that, and we'll collectively all try to weigh in and answer any other questions that folks may have as it relates to, further ways to get involved and other things like that. And with that, we will go ahead and get into it. I will pass it to our questions facilitator, and we will go ahead and get started with, I believe, some questions from some previous events.
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie, and welcome everyone. Excited to be here with you. So please feel free to ask any questions that you have about the bills, about lobbying, anything that's coming up this week. If you have questions, please think of those now, and we'll be here to help you. So the way it's going to work is you can please raise your hand, and then someone from the team will ask you to unmute. You can also write it in the chat if you would prefer, and then we'll go down the list and answer all of your questions. But we're going to give you a moment to think of your questions first if you're not quite sure what you want to ask yet. And I will ask our panelists questions that came up during previous trainings that we've had and different events that we've had. So we'll start off with those while you raise your hands or type in your questions, and then we'll get to the live questions. So one of the first ones I'm going to start with that came up at our kickoff is if the ACLU ever works closely with an assembly member or a state senator to write bills. So I'm going to hand that over either to Kalyn or to Kathy to answer.
Happy to start. So the answer is yes. Typically with a lot of the bills, certainly the ones that we sponsor, usually it's legislative attorneys like Kathy, and then myself and some of the other lobbyists who help to draft take the initial pass at drafting language so that we can help to shape what it's going to ultimately look like. And a lot of that comes after several weeks, if not months, or even a longer roadmap of years of really doing kind of the work to evaluate the issue, try and avoid any unintended consequences or harm and things like that, and really speaking to a variety of stakeholders, including partners, members, and potentially opposition to the bill and things like that. So the short answer is yes, ACLU does typically work with legislators, more so their staff, their office staff, to draft the bill language.
Thanks so much, Kalyn. And like I said, please write your questions in the chat or raise your hand and we'll get to them. But I'll go with another really good question that was asked at our kickoff. Can a bill be amended after the Assembly and or Senate pass a bill? And what does the process look like when that happens?
I can take that one. So in California, we have a bicameral legislature, and so any bill is introduced in either the Assembly or the Senate, and then it has to get through the House that it was introduced in, and then usually is amended along the way, at least somewhat, goes over to the other House. So say it's an Assembly bill, it passes out of the Assembly, it goes to the Senate in its amended form. The Senate can then make further amendments to it as it's going through committees and going to the floor in the Senate. Once those amendments have been made, though, it goes back to the Assembly for a concurrence vote. That means that the Assembly says, we're okay with these amendments that you made over in the Senate. And at that point, it cannot be amended anymore. Very occasionally, if the two houses are unable to agree, there are certain issues that will go to something called the conference committee, but that's very much the exception rather than the rule. So once it has passed out of whichever is the second House for it, it can't be amended anymore. It goes back to the first House just for agreement on the amendments that have been made.
Thank you. Another question we had is how quickly are bills implemented once they've passed?
It can depend on the actual bill language. So I would say probably the majority of bills usually get implemented the following year, usually at the top of the year. So January 1st, in this case, 2023. But if the bill was written in a certain way, it can either have what's called an urgency clause. And so it can actually start to get implemented much sooner once, let's say, it passes out of the legislature and the governor signs it. So it's on a bit of an expedited timeline. Or there's the other scenario where you might want to delay implementation, perhaps to give the local levels time to ramp up or something like that. And so that can have a kind of a set date in the bill language. There is no rule to follow with that. And so it just depends on what was worked out during the drafting process, or unfortunately the amendment process, if the bill had to take some hits as it went through the steps.
Thanks, Kalyn. So now I'm going to get into specifics about bills that was asked before, and maybe this will get your wheels turning. So specifically about SB 1038, which is the facial recognition bill. So why does this facial recognition technology have different success rates in identifying people of different races or of different genders?
Great question. So with a face print, which is what's taken when your image is picked up by the facial recognition technology, through mathematical code, it then becomes kind of this biometric identifier, similar to what you might see when you take a fingerprint or even a DNA sample. That mathematical code is trained on white faces. They actually do not train on people of color. And so that's what they're doing as they're kind of setting up the software. We know that once the software is created, then it does get beta tested on people of color, but the actual training is typically done of white faces. I think that there's still so much to be learned with the technology. I think if they were able to get it right, we certainly wouldn't need a bill like this, but I think that there's so many errors that go into it in terms of it's not just the facial recognition technology that's problematic, it's also trying to install it on the police-worn body cameras, which is the whole crux of this bill, because it's not trying to prevent all facial recognition technology or all biometric surveillance. In the narrow scope of body cameras, officers are usually in near constant motion, if not, they could even be running in pursuit. And so the shaky nature of the camera, coupled with the wide angled lenses of the cameras, often result in warped faces. So it's blurry images and warped faces. And so research has shown that those faces typically do get misidentified, and it's predominantly affecting people of color the most, as well as women.
Thanks so much, Kalyn. Another one for that bill is why was the previous bill only for, I believe 3 years? Why wasn't it a permanent bill like this one?
Great question. I think, the policy process is incremental. So when you start out at the top of the leg session, or once you have the bill language introduced and ready, very rarely does your bill end up looking like that exact form, because it's going to take some hits as it moves. Each policy committee has an opportunity to make some amendments. Opposition can certainly try and work to suggest amendments. And so after a while, the bill might have several amendments that can cause it to be watered down, or can cause some pretty big changes made to it. And so with this bill, there were some folks, particularly moderate Democrats, but there were several folks who did not feel like technology should be banned. And that's not just even within FRT or facial recognition technology or biometric surveillance, but several folks have this idea that technology should be regulated instead of a ban. Or if we're going to do a temporary ban, let's do it for a couple of years and then pause so we can reevaluate it. And so unfortunately, some mod Dems on the Senate side were successful in 2019 when the bill was in the second house, and they were able to impose a 3-year sunset, which means it expires on January 1, 2023. And that was almost conditional in order for the bill to pass. Folks were really saying that if that provision was not made, the bill would have died and it would never have passed out of the legislature. And then, we can't speak for whether it would have gotten signed by the governor's office, but most likely the intel from then administration, Governor Brown, it would not have probably gotten signed.
Thanks, Kalyn. And that reinforces why these lobby visits are so important, so that the legislators know that these bills are really important to us, that their constituents are watching, and that we don't want, that we would prefer these bills to be permanent. One question, Kalyn, about this bill, and then I'll move to some questions about the school bill, is what are the costs? Is there a cost tied to SB 1038?
The short answer is no, because of the fact that this bill is not asking for law enforcement to do anything that they're already doing today. So it's not taking away anything. They currently do not have facial recognition technology in conjunction with their body-worn cameras. So all it's doing is asking them to just preserve the current law. So there is no cost to this bill.
Thanks so much. So a question that we had about the bill that's going to eliminate law enforcement mandates in school. Why were there mandates for police in schools in the first place? Like, what was some of the rationale, and how are we trying to correct that with this bill?
Yeah, so I think the laws that put in place a lot of the mandates that we have now for schools to call law enforcement for a whole range of different kinds of student behaviors really date back to the 1990s, where, you know, across the board, not just in schools, but generally we were seeing so much tough on crime rhetoric. And the answer to everything was always more law enforcement response. And so, you know, schools bought into this, you know, very racist framework around where all kinds of things that really should be a matter of school discipline and providing appropriate kinds of supports to students instead became a matter for, you know, referral to law enforcement and potentially you know, criminalizing student behavior and putting students into the juvenile justice system. You know, so I think we are now at a point where, you know, we've been talking for many years and trying to figure out ways to roll back a lot of those changes that were made in the 90s and in schools. You know, one of the really important ways is giving schools, you know, just as a starting step, it's really just the flexibility to decide what the appropriate response is and not be, you know, pushed by the state to say, whenever, you know, a kid is acting out of line, we're going to have to call in the cops. But to be able to make the decision about what's going to encourage proper student behavior and create a school climate where everyone feels welcome, where the students are getting what they need to be able to learn, and everybody is in a learning community together.
Thanks. And a really good question is, are the police mandates in all public schools, or have we noticed that there are discrepancies of which neighborhoods or schools or communities that these mandates exist?
That's a fantastic question. So, you know, the nature of what we're doing with the legislation is, of course, to affect state law. So there are certain state laws that across the entire state for all public schools require that the school call law enforcement when certain kinds of incidents occur, which can be everything from you know, possession of cannabis to anything that can be construed as an assault on a teacher. There's really a very broad range of behaviors that those apply to. But, you know, what we know is that, of course, schools see different behaviors in different ways, depending on who the student is and how they, you know, and how they react to, you know, really the very same behavior in you know, a white student in an affluent school district. This teacher is not going to perceive it as an assault, where if it's a Black student and it's a less affluent school district, they're much more likely to say, this is an assault on me and I'm going to call the cops. So one of the really important reasons to get rid of these mandates is that all the schools across the state need to know that they don't need to, you know, whatever the behavior is, that they're not required to call the cops, regardless of, you know, how they're perceiving it based on the student, that they can make a decision about what the right response is in the particular circumstance.
Thanks. So I'll ask just one more question for you, Kathy, and then I'll go to the raised hands. So is there an associated cost with this bill?
Yeah, I think that's also a good question. So I'm just going to note that bills get tagged as fiscal, which means they go to the appropriations committees, even if what they think is that this is a bill that will save money. It's any change in costs for the state. And in this case, I think we have a really strong argument that the bill will in fact save money, because school staff that was having to take the time to make a report to the police, where that isn't something they otherwise would do. And they may be doing it in addition to whatever the school's other response is, that's additional staff time for the school. And of course, on the law enforcement end, calls that they're not getting are calls that they do not have to respond to. And what we know from the statistics that we're getting out of when things are reported to law enforcement is in a majority of those cases, when law enforcement comes to the school, they end up telling the school, this is yours to handle. This is not an appropriate case for us anyhow. So, not only would it save money, it's going to save what is really wasted money on unnecessary law enforcement response that no one thinks is needed.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the raised hands. So I'm going to go to Cybele. Apologies if that's not how you pronounce your name. If you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, sorry about that. What I'm asking is, what about private schools? If they don't have police on them and there's no mandate, then this very unfair and unequal justice is based on classism, based on money.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Students who have, whose families have the resources to send them to private schools don't have to worry that their kid is going to get unnecessarily referred to law enforcement. And I think probably the parents in private schools would react very negatively and not keep their kids in those schools if that was their reaction to the kinds of incidents that public schools are mandated to call the police in.
Thanks so much. Randy, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
So Kara had a question too, California Alliance for Retired Americans. And their question was about the mandated police, about the county coroner bill. Their problem with the county coroner bill was that some counties are going to be able to have this standard, and some counties are very poor and they won't be able to have this standard. So their question was, if you live in a county, a rural county, where it doesn't have the same kind of resources economically and physically, how are you going to be able to enforce this bill if they don't have the money in the county in the first place?
Great question. First, I'll just start by responding and saying, when you look at county budgets, over 50% is usually put towards public safety. And a lot of that 50% is specifically put towards law enforcement. And that's across most counties, including the rural ones. And so the money is being allocated somewhere. And so one of the suggestions that we have as co-sponsors is perhaps there needs to be a reallocation. So for example, right now, when you look at the 48 counties that have the combined sheriff and coroner model, where the sheriff is the coroner and they don't have a separate office like the other 10, when you look at their budget allocations, money is already going to the sheriff. And so perhaps they can reallocate so that it's not going to him, or at least the component of the coroner as it relates to the death investigations and things like that. Shifting that money over to the independent office is something that could happen. Another thing to note too is this bill does not prevent counties from contracting out. And so many counties today do already contract out the medical side of things. They'll contract out to get a medical examiner, which has to be a licensed pathologist, someone with years of experience, as well as a medical background, which is not the case for the coroner. And so this bill still allows them to do that. And this is something that we know that the smaller counties are probably still going to want to take advantage of. There's several that contract out to Placer County, for example, because Placer has 2 doctors available and things like that. So they'll still be able to do that once AB 1608 passes. Actually, can I say one more thing? I'm sorry. And then I think the other thing to note too is when you look at the settlements. It stinks to bring this up, but when you look at the settlements that counties are paying to families under the category of kind of wrongful death and lawsuits, David Silva, their family was paid out $3.8 million. That's chump change to how much it's going to cost to open up and to stand an independent office. When you look at the some of the counties that have shifted, so one of the 10, for example, Calaveras County, when they separated from their combined model, their annual budget was about $189,000 in about 2014. When they separated the following year, I believe it was 2015, the budget went up, but about $209,000. So we're not talking, hundreds of thousands of dollars or certainly millions, like the CSAC opposition letter mentioned. I know that was raised earlier this morning in the first group at 11. So I will say that it's not as inflated as I think folks are saying. And then I think the last point before I forget, what's interesting is when we have had meetings with some of the folks who have submitted opposition letters, in particular, the representatives of counties, whether it's all 58, whether it's the rural counties or whether it's the urban counties. What's interesting is they haven't been able to give us actual breakdowns and allocations in the budget like we've requested. A lot of times the response that we get back is things like, it's hard for us to know, each county is different, each county has a different setup. Or at best, they're able to give us kind of a very general description of, let's say, roles and tasks. So they'll say things like, we have administration being done under this combined office, or, certainly the medical component. And most of them, like I said, are contracting out. And so when you listen to the breakdown, they're not offering dollar amounts, but most of the breakdown is actually things that can just easily be shifted. And so again, we would love for the state to consider what the costs are in comparison to the settlements that are being paid out for these deaths that are caused at the hands of law enforcement versus the amount of money that it would cost to rightfully stand up an independent office that would give families peace of mind, free from bias, inherent bias that comes into play when police and law enforcement are investigating the cause of death.
Thanks, Kalyn. I think Lori also put that question about CSAC's estimate of how much more it was going to cost, but I think you gave really good talking points if that question is asked. The next question is from Jasper, and it's written down. So it says, I know the ACLU has a mobile app. How effective is it? What is the process that happens when you use it? Is it a tool that we should be promoting, especially as it relates to school age students? So I can answer this one, and I welcome anyone else from the affiliate that wants to talk about the mobile justice app. So if you go to the App Store, we have a mobile justice app, and what happens is it's super easy, and it has like basically one function, which is a record function on your camera that will record what's happening. Usually it's interactions with law enforcement or with government officials, and it automatically gets sent to our intake servers at the ACLU. And even if, for say, your phone is batted down or it's dropped or something happens, anything that was recorded while the camera was on is automatically preserved in our servers. So you don't have to worry about anyone smashing your phone or breaking it. And we do encourage people to use this app. I have it with me. I've gone to several actions and protests, and I have it ready to go in case anything happens with the law enforcement that is there. Also encourage students who are in school to have it and use it. Our education equity team has frequently promotes it when they go to schools. So when students are questioned about if they're stopped or asked to show what's in their backpack or ever searched, we definitely encourage them to have that and record any interaction that they have with either law enforcement or even with school administration officials who are questioning them. So definitely encourage you to have it for yourself and encourage you to share it with others. Other questions? I'm going down the chat. Okay, can you share the full list of 10 counties that have already separated the sheriff and coroner role?
Yes, I'm typing it into the chat now, almost finished. I think I've got about 9 in there. Give me 1 sec to get the 10th one. But I'll put it in the chat in 1 second. Please don't wait for me though.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks. So another question is, if a person wants to gain access to what they've recorded. Okay, so what I would recommend is using the app or just emailing the ACLU intake line. We can provide you the recording that was provided. Does anyone have? Oh, I see a raised hand. Arlene, you can unmute yourself. Arlene, are you able to unmute yourself? Oh, Arlene, we can't hear you.
There you go. It kept bouncing back and forth. My bad. Anyway, I was wondering, is there any documentation, like, has there been any data on students in schools and how many of the situations, like the percentage of situations that actually occurred in a judicial case? Like, how many calls are made versus how many are actually sent to court?
Right,
And-
okay, thank you.
And the second part is, how many, has it been a deterrent having this done? Like, has it decreased crime in the school? I'm curious as to any data about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think the first part, I don't know of a source for the statistics, certainly at a statewide level, that would get at that question of out of all of the referrals to law enforcement for school-based incidents, how many of those wind up going into where the person actually winds up being cited or arrested and having a juvenile court case against them. As far as I know, the statistics aren't quite collected in that way on the state level, and I don't know of an analysis that gets at that. I think one of the problems that we've been up against in looking at this issue and in pushing for this legislation is even the things that schools are supposed to report, and there are some fairly robust requirements for schools to report to the federal government when students are arrested or have other interactions with law enforcement at schools, and also when the school, obviously some districts employ school resource officers. All of that is supposed to be reported to the federal government. And what we find is that in districts where we know that there are quite a number of student arrests, they'll just put in zeros and the stuff that gets reported to the federal government. So, it is hard to get at the question of how many of the students who are the subject of incidents where law enforcement is called in actually wind up going into the juvenile justice system. I think what we do know from the numbers that we do have, and there's a couple of different sources, and I will post a link in the chat to the ACLU's most recent report on what we do know, if you will, about school policing. We do know that in a majority of cases, it's not something that leads to an arrest, and that in fact, in many of the cases, what happens is, as I said, the police will, well, in some cases, the police they're not required to come to the school. It's a requirement that the school notify them. So sometimes there's not even an interaction, which I think is a good thing. But even in those cases where they do come and respond to the incident, we know that in most of those cases, it is for some kind of minor misbehavior, and they'll just end up saying, school, you're the ones who should be dealing with this. We're not going to do anything about it. So as I say, I will post that link that has some of those numbers that we're getting from a number of different sources on arrests in schools. The second question as to deterrent effect, I think that one, so far as I know, there's nothing to suggest that when these laws were put into effect and there was stronger law enforcement response to student incidents that crime in schools went down at that point. I think the statistics for crime in schools are similar to statistics for crime overall, and respond to a number of things, but it's not really about law enforcement response as a deterrent to those crimes. It's a lot of other things that go into in the school context, what shapes the school climate, what makes the students feel that they're part of a community, and helps keep that community safe by having everyone rely on each other and having the school provide the things that the students need to get from the school.
Thanks, Kathy. Jasmine, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I had two questions based off the same bill. The first one being, one, like, what was the reason behind enforcing this mandate within schools? And then the second question being, I know or like more of a clarifying question, does removing the mandate kind of address the internal biases that teachers would have? And does it like totally remove their right to call the police essentially based off of that? I hope that made sense.
That made total sense. Good and great question. I think again, we go back, the reason for the mandate is we really went through a period where a lot of students, and particularly students of color, were just seen as dangerous. And the response to that danger at that point in time was, we need to make sure that they are adequately policed. And that is not the right way to deal with young people, but California, like a lot of other places, certainly went down that road for a long while, with slightly different kind of flavors. There's two different sections of the law that our bill affects, and I think they came from slightly different places, but basically that was the underlying ideology, was these are dangerous young people who need to be policed, and let's make sure that the schools are responding in that way whenever something is going wrong. And then the second part, unfortunately, just removing the mandate, of course, is not going to address the issue of the bias that teachers and school administrators and other school adults in schools bring to interactions with their students. And, we're going to continue to have to fight against the things that, bring those people to refer students to law enforcement or to call in law enforcement when there's a lot better ways to deal with these incidents. And we're going to continue to see the kinds of disparities in terms of when law enforcement is called and which students suffer at the hands of law enforcement. The bill does not at all stop schools from calling law enforcement when they think that is the appropriate response. It really puts that discretion in the hands of schools. And then, I think the next step is to figure out how do we make sure that schools are treating their students fairly, taking the right approach when incidents of student behavior occur, and also frankly to make sure that, I think a big part of it is the schools need to know that they have the resources to provide students with supports, that if what a student needs is to be able to talk to a counselor, if a student may need for there to be a restorative justice process in place to respond to an incident. There's a lot of different things that may be leading up to the behaviors that law enforcement is now called in to address. Schools need to have the resources to make sure that their students are getting what they need so that the schools are safe places and the students aren't engaging in those behaviors.
Arlene, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, Mike, this is just a continuation, I guess. Data. The number of schools in the counties where what is quote marginalized communities, is there data on the number of calls that are made in those communities? That's my first question. And my second question is, in those same marginalized communities where the possibility of, because you have ACE and AB 112 was passed, and a lot of things were passed in which it was never really followed through on in these same marginalized communities. Is there a plan to develop restorative justice counseling for the youth, or any other tools that might be necessary and beneficial to help them overcome whatever the situation is? So I hear, like, on the one side, this is what we're trying to do, but on the other hand, if you're going to take that away, what is being added in order to assist this youth community in being able to learn how to resolve, if in fact, because I don't know about the data of the amount of what kind of calls are being made, what they're being made for, anything like that. And so, like, how can you get the resources if you don't really know what all the situations are? So I was just wondering if there's data on that, and if in fact the Department of Education is working on a plan to collaborate and bring in these resources to these communities where they say that this is happening, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, again, when it comes to the questions of the numbers, the information we have now, it comes from two different sources. One is the federal reporting that is required from schools, and that is it happens at a school by school basis. So you would be able to identify, kind of what was happening in particular schools, and then, aggregate those schools to look at particular communities. But as I said, a lot of that reporting is just not properly done by the schools, frankly, where they are underreporting things like calls to police from their schools. The other source that is a newer source of data is the Racial Identity and Profiling Act requires law enforcement to report on what are called stops. And that includes stops of students. And when the location is a school, then we know about that stop. It isn't completely rolled out to cover all law enforcement agencies in California, although that will happen, I believe, next year. But we are starting to see the numbers for the largest law enforcement agencies and when they are in school. So that doesn't typically include school police forces, which is of course a large number of stops in schools. But when it is a city or county law enforcement agency that's coming into the school and having an interaction with the student, we have information on that from RIPA. And again, I think what we know is from those numbers is a lot of those cases are for relatively minor kinds of infractions or disobedience to school rules, even not necessarily something that is even a criminal offense in any way. And that in many of those cases, in fact, there is no follow-up by the police, which, you know, is a good thing from the perspective of the students, but we also know that even just interacting with law enforcement has negative effects on the students down the line. And also that you know, marginalized students are the ones who are most likely to have further follow-up from law enforcement and suffer the ill effects of that as well. As to the second question, as far as figuring out how to make sure that schools have things in place so that when they're not calling police, they are hopefully, you know, resorting to more helpful alternatives. I mean, certainly we know that a lot of schools have at least some resources available now to do that. You know, many schools across California, you know, people have school counselors. Many schools and school districts do have restorative justice programs. There are a lot of things that are in place now that schools can use to address student behaviors and do in many cases. Like, obviously, you don't have to call the law enforcement for everything that happens in a school, and schools have their own ways of dealing with student disciplinary issues or school climate issues. As far as, you know, we certainly have been robust supporters of, there's been a lot of legislation and budgetary action in the state, especially since the pandemic, to bolster the resources that go towards young people's mental health, including resources that will go to schools to increase mental health staffing. To some extent, those decisions about staffing are made at the local level because of the way school funding works in California and the local control funding formula. We have also been active in a number of communities to make sure that the local, at the local level, that school districts are making the decision not to hire law enforcement to deal with what should be dealt with by providing the kinds of supports that students need, and advocating to have more counselors, more school psychologists and school social workers available to students to respond to the kinds of needs that they have and to provide the supports that are needed. But you know, we plan very much to continue that work both at the state level and the local level to make sure that students are getting what they need in their schools.
Thanks, Kathy. So we only have less than 10 minutes left. So I think this might be the last question unless anyone has a burning one. But Randy made a really good point in the chat. Given that this is an election year and that there has been redistricting, so many legislators will be running for election in new districts, do we think that how they approach these bills might be different if they're right up for re-election or they have a new district?
I'm curious to hear what Kathy thinks, but I tend to be a bit more pessimistic when it comes to legislation. And I think that policing tends to be a pretty tricky issue. Not that others aren't, so I don't mean that, but I just mean that I haven't seen a lot of changes this year. The same folks who didn't vote for bills last year or trying to force amendments are the same ones who did it, you know, last year, the year before, and the year before that. So yes, redistricting and also elections, re-elections can help sometimes, and you need to kind of stay up on it to be savvy enough to know when to pull that card and when to recognize that their political climate and their stance perhaps, or just what they're willing to leverage away. You have to be, you know, mindful of that. But at the same time, I think that I haven't seen the benefits of that yet in this session. But Kathy, if you have anything else, I'm curious.
I mean, I just was going to kind of pass, you know, I mean, I think it is very much received wisdom, and I think rightly so that in an election year, it is just going to be that much harder to pass anything that has to do with criminal justice reform, including in this case, for me, the school police mandate bill, just because it is. It's an issue that I think it really depends on the district, how it plays with people's constituencies, but I think it's really hard to convince legislators that that their constituents don't want kind of a more tough on crime approach. And again, I think that's another reason why what you're all doing is so important, because they need to hear from active, engaged constituents who are saying, yeah, I don't support that approach. I want you to take this other approach.
That's really helpful. And I'll just share some insights. So I work out of Orange County, and one legislator who got redistricted into a heavily Latino district that has not met with us for the past 2 years and doesn't really respond to requests from constituents did agree to meet with us this time around. I don't know if that means anything, but they are up for re-election with a much more progressive candidates in their district. So, but I'll be happy to let both you, Kalyn and Kathy, know if it means anything that meeting was actually taken. And then Randy asked another question. For these bills, how are they being enforced by the state agencies?
I think it depends on the bill itself, and it depends on if the bill is going to, if it requires implementation through an agency. So for example, like the 2 bills I'm doing right now, neither one are going to have to go through something. But if you all remember the work on last year, I think the conference prioritized SB2, for example. That was one of them. That is, that has to go through implementation right now. And as we speak, actually, they're in a post workshop with the peace officer standards and training, and they're figuring out how to model the curriculum that's going to be rolled out and things like that. So it all depends on what agency is going to be affected by the bill, or what agency has the responsibility for the implementation.
Great. Okay, so Kathy, do you want to answer how the enforcement state agencies will enforce the school one?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about the mandated removing mandates to call police is I don't, there's not really enforcement, right? It means that the choices with the schools, they may continue to want to call police in certain circumstances. But hopefully, I think we would certainly do some work with our allies in this area to make sure that all the school districts understand that the law has changed, and that they know that they are no longer required to call the police in various circumstances where they were in the past. But beyond that, it's the schools that will be making the decisions about that.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much, everyone. I want to be mindful of our time. We only have a few minutes left. But if you have any other questions that come up, we're going to share an email pretty soon that you can email with any other follow-up questions. So Kalyn and Kathy, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and spending the evening with us. So I'm going to pass it back to Katie to close us out before we can get on with the evening. Katie?
Thank you so much again to Kathy and Kalyn. And please, folks, let's just go ahead and give some thanks up for Cynthia as well for that fantastic Q&A facilitation, making sure we got those hands raised, addressed, pulling up those old questions that came out way early on in the chat. Thank you so much fitting in everyone's follow-up questions and stuff like that. So just give it up for Cynthia really fast, folks. Okay. And to go ahead and wrap us up, this is a fantastic reminder of this week's events and what else we have coming for you all for the conference. So tomorrow, our ledge visits kicks off tomorrow. They kick off Tuesday through Thursday. Okay, is when it's going to be our ledge visits. And so tomorrow, Thursday, I know I have mine scheduled. And if folks that are on lobby teams and stuff like that, you should have already heard from your lobby captains by now with your date times and stuff like that. And so we have some text banks the 26th and the 27th as well. And then Thursday we also have our fantastic closing celebration. You guys do not want to miss our closing celebration. There are going to be some great entertainment for you all, and we're going to spend time welcoming and thanking everybody. And so yeah, with that, I think we are at the end. Oh, yes. Keep us posted. Be sure to take notes throughout the week. write down your favorite quotes, your favorite speakers, some of the things that you may have heard that you want to follow up on. Take screenshots of your favorite moments. Okay, folks, we love that sort of participation. Email that stuff to changemakers@aclunc.org. Again, there will be some links sent around, some emails sent around with further information for that. And last but not least, yes, we are up on our social media, folks. So we want to encourage folks to tweet, and post things using our social media accounts, using hashtag CalAction22. Okay, and then you also want to tag us right here. You see our Twitter handle there. Okay, folks. And so, yeah, you guys, we're up to date with our social media. So we want to encourage folks to participate along those lines as well. And thank you again. And we really appreciate it spending this time with everyone. And have a great rest of your day. And see you all for your ledge visits and stuff. Thank you so much.